on a £5 note, in tiny writing, it actually says, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5. What? That's just a promise to give back the £5. Well, modern money theory, MMT, as explained by Randall Wray in his book about MMT, gives rise to a suggestion for a much more sensible promise that should be printed on each such pound or dollar note. But to explain the idea, we first need to go through the logic of MMT itself. And indeed, this is going to be the first in a little series of videos in which I try to illustrate and explain some of the key ideas in the third edition of Wray's book about MMT. Because with all of the political economic changes going on in the world, like the possible need for UBI if AI takes more and more of our jobs, I think it's really important for all of us to have a better understanding of how money actually works. So in this first video, I'm going to build up what Wray calls the pyramid of liabilities that explain the hierarchy of I.O.Us that form the monetary accounting of the dollar or pound economies. We'll also be looking at how money gets created at the various levels. And then, at the top of this pyramid, we'll find the MMT answer to what would be a better promise to write on a £5 note. So in this video, I'm mostly going to be talking about dollars because that's what Wray focuses on in his book, and because it is still the world's reserve currency. But most of what I'm saying here also applies to any other country with a sovereign fiat currency, like Britain with the pound and Japan with the yen. To get going, we're going to start from a more tangible, everyday scenario with a fellow I'll call Jack going to a bar and ordering a drink, but asking for it to go on his tab. Later, of course, he ought to come back and pay off his tab. But let's imagine now that the bar also sells $10 gift cards, and today Jack asks if he could buy a gift card on his tab. We can look at the end result of this transaction in terms of the assets and liabilities of each party. Jack now has the $10 gift card as an asset, and conversely, that same gift card is now a liability for the bar, because they have to potentially redeem it later for beers or whatever. But the bar also has the asset of the $10 bar tab that Jack owes back to them. And Jack has this bar tab as a liability that he owes. For both parties, the new assets and liabilities cancel each other out. So while two new I.O.Us were created, no new net wealth was magically created for either party at the moment of the transaction. But just to note, the bar's full balance sheet may well include the ownership of the bar itself, a real asset. And similarly, Jack maybe owns a car that would be listed as a real asset on his full balance sheet. And so, more generally, a balance sheet would show how financial assets plus real assets minus financial liabilities equals the person's or entity's net wealth or equity. But here we'll mostly be focusing on financial assets and liabilities. And now we can extend our scenario to imagine how the local community who live near this popular bar might come to use these gift cards as a kind of local currency. So Jack can now use the gift card as, say, payment for some eggs from the local farmer. And the farmer will accept the gift card as payment because he knows its value in the local bar. As long as the bar does continue to redeem the gift cards for beer or whatever, they will continue to hold some meaningful value in the local community. So what we've seen here is that an exchange of I.O.Us between Jack and the bar has actually created a tradable item, the gift card, that can be used in the local economy as a kind of local money. So we've seen how a bar can issue a gift card with a balancing bar tab. So too, at the next level up, we can see that if a high street bank loaned $1,000 to Jack, this has some similarities. Indeed, just as the barman could create the gift cards himself, so too the bank creates the $1,000 of digital deposits itself simply by marking up Jack's bank account. They don't reuse existing money. This is newly created money. One difference is that, unlike the bar's gift cards, the $1,000 in Jack's digital deposit account are exactly worth their face value. If Jack withdraws the $1,000, the bank would give him $1,000 worth of actual physical currency. But nowadays, many of us live a largely cashless life, and so dollars or pounds in digital deposit accounts is how we keep and use most of our day-to-day money. Again, from an assets and liabilities perspective, Jack now has $1,000 of digital deposits in his account, which for the bank is a liability that they have to honor. The bank, however, has the asset of the loan agreement with Jack that balances out this liability. And Jack has the liability of paying back the loan. No new net wealth is created at the moment of this transaction. And the vast majority of money in circulation, roughly 90% of the dollars or pounds in the economy, are essentially created in this way, by banks issuing loans. Now, if we go up one more level to the central bank and treasury, and if you squint a little, then there is again a sort of similarity to how the central bank creates central bank dollar reserves as a form of I.O.U. that often ends up being balanced by a debt I.O.U. issued by the treasury, like treasury bonds. We'll come back to why this isn't quite accurate, but first, I just want to note that these central bank dollar reserves are the central bank's equivalent of the digital deposit account. But only institutions like banks and the Treasury, and indeed foreign central banks, can actually have reserve accounts with the central bank, whereas businesses and individuals would have deposit accounts at a commercial bank. Now, if we include into this picture the physical currency of notes and coins that are also issued by the government, then together with the central bank reserves, these top-level kinds of dollars are sometimes referred to as base money or as high-powered money, as they are the foundation on which the whole dollar economy rests. And it's worth noting that the balance sheet of the central bank accounts for all high-powered money issued into the economy. It's also worth noting that the notes and coins circulate in the broader economy, along with the digital bank deposits, and together they're known as the broad money supply. In contrast, the central bank reserves are only used for interbank transactions and do not enter the broader economy. But let's go back a step. I said this picture is only true if you squint, and that's because legally in America, the Fed, their central bank, cannot issue reserves for loans directly to the Treasury like this. Instead, what happens is that the Treasury will issue a bond and sell it to a commercial bank in exchange for reserves. And then, later, that bank might sell on that bond to the central bank in return for reserves that have been newly created by the central bank. These new digital reserves, they're simply created by keystrokes on a computer in the Fed, as acknowledged in this clip of Ben Bernanke, the then chair of the Fed.
Is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed. So it's much more akin, although not exactly the same, but it's much more akin to printing money than it is to borrowing.
And as Wray says in his book, so we could have the Fed directly accept a Treasury I.O.U. and keystroke bank reserves, but we don't do that either. We say that although the Fed is the Treasury's bank, it is prohibited from directly accepting a Treasury I.O.U. And hence we created complex procedures that involve private banks, the Fed, and the Treasury to accomplish the same thing. So, especially during times when the central bank is buying a lot of Treasury securities, a process known as quantitative easing, the commercial bank is effectively just acting as a middleman to legally enable the central bank to lend money to the Treasury. This is what happened during the 2008 financial crash and during the COVID crisis. Now, in terms of assets and liabilities, the Treasury ends up with reserves that it can spend on government functions. And for the central bank, these reserves in the Treasury account are a liability. But the central bank ends up with the offsetting bond asset, which is also the offsetting liability for the Treasury. The commercial bank that facilitated the transaction ends up with the same reserves that it started with. Of course, in reality, it would have made a profit from this transaction, but we'll keep it simple here. Now, these reserves of the commercial bank will be an additional liability of the central bank. And these reserves would probably have come about from an earlier issuing of debt by the Treasury that will be an additional asset of the central bank and an additional liability of the Treasury. So the central bank has roughly balanced assets and liabilities. The commercial bank has positive net wealth, but the financial balance sheet of the Treasury has a position with net liabilities. It's in debt. But note, this picture does not include the broader real assets of the nation. And also note that in this simple example, the net wealth of the private bank is equal to the debt of the Treasury. Indeed, this link between the size of the total government debt and the total net positive wealth of the non-government sector is one of the key identities that modern monetary theorists highlight. You simply cannot have all sectors of the economy in financial surplus at the same time, but we'll come back to this in a later video. So we've now looked at the three levels of I.O.Us that can be thought of as forming the dollar monetary system. But let's look at how they each relate to each other. We started with Jack and the bar exchanging I.O.Us of the gift card and bar tab, but they will both also have I.O.Us like bank deposit accounts and maybe outstanding loans that were issued at the bank level. Then the commercial banks will in turn have I.O.Us of central bank reserves and probably treasury securities which were issued at the government level. And the central bank and treasury will also have the I.O.Us implied by notes and coins. And of course, there will be other commercial banks and other businesses. So we have the three connecting layers of what Wray called the pyramid of liabilities: the government I.O.Us, the bank I.O.Us, and then the non-banking I.O.Us of informal or formal contracts that form debit and credit relations within the broader economy. And there are a couple of things that Wray notes about this pyramid. The first is that the I.O.Us issued by those higher in the pyramid are generally more acceptable, more dependable, because those higher up are usually more creditworthy than those lower down. In general, the bar or other businesses are more likely to go bankrupt than a bank, and a bank is more likely to go bankrupt than the government. And secondly, the I.O.Us of each level of the pyramid typically leverage the I.O.Us of the higher levels. For example, there are roughly 10 times as many dollars issued as digital bank deposits as there are high-powered reserve dollars issued by the central bank. And then, throughout the book, Wray uses the idea of these financial accounts as being like a financial scorecard of the economy. Of course, the numbers I have here are completely made up, but just trying to capture a sense that every entity in the economy can be thought of as having a balance sheet holding their scorecard. And then, particular transactions between entities will result in a change of these balances. And Wray refers to Wynne Godley's notion of seeing the values in the balance sheets as being stocks and transactions as being flows between these stocks. Indeed, I talked more about these ideas in my video about Steve Keen's book, The New Economics, where he too builds on Godley's ideas about stocks and flows. But here, I just want to finish off this pyramid kind of model of the monetary system by bringing into it the link to foreign central banks that often have an account with the American central bank in order to hold their foreign dollar reserves. And indeed, these foreign central banks can then form their own local monetary pyramid of dollars in the foreign country, servicing the dollar requirements of the businesses and individuals in that country. So we can then overlay onto this pyramid the three major macroeconomic sectors: the government sector, the private domestic sector, and the foreign sector. And at this macro level, we can then talk about the stocks and flows between these sectors in the aggregate. And in other videos, we'll come back to look at what Wray says MMT has to say about the interaction between the domestic and foreign parts of the economy, including in relation to foreign ownership of government debt and to fixed versus floating exchange rates. But here, I just want to note that we've now built up a complete picture of the whole of the dollar monetary system. And this pyramid structure with the foreign sector too can also be imagined for the fiat currencies of other countries, like the British pound or the Japanese yen. But this leaves two related questions as yet unanswered. The first is that we know that the promised I.O.U. of the bar's gift cards could be redeemed for beers. But what is it that the promise on the British £5 note can actually be redeemed for? It's no longer gold, so what is it? And secondly, given that the American economy and dollar monetary system is so much larger than the British pounds or Japanese yen's monetary system, why do people in Britain use pounds and in Japan they use yen? Modern monetary theorists find the answer to both these questions in ideas that could be seen to relate back to the chartalism of Georg Friedrich Knapp from the early 1900s, which sees money as being a legal creation of the state. In particular, MMT argues that it is the tax obligations placed on people by the state that creates demand for a specific currency. As Wray says in his book, we can conclude that taxes drive money. The government first creates a money of account, the dollar in Australia, the tenge in Kazakhstan, and the peso in the Philippines, and then imposes tax obligations in that national money of account. In all modern nations, this is sufficient to ensure that many, indeed most, debts, assets, and prices will also be denominated in the national money of account. So British individuals and companies need to accumulate British pounds so that they can pay their taxes to the government in pounds, because that is the only currency that the British government will accept for settling tax obligations. And to establish how much tax is owed, people and companies need to present their accounts to the government using the pound as the unit of account. So for the vast majority of British businesses, it's simpler to use British pounds for all of their records. Of course, this isn't the only thing that gives the pound real purchasing power, but the government's imposed tax and accounting obligations provide a significant anchor that grounds the use and value of the pound in Britain, and similarly the yen in Japan, and so on. So it is simply incorrect if anyone suggests that MMT says there's no need to tax the economy. It's quite the opposite. MMT notes that in each country there needs to be sufficient national tax obligations on the local economy to drive local demand for the national fiat currency. So we finally get back to what Wray suggests would be a better promise to have written on a £5 note. The promise to pay that is engraved on UK pound notes is superfluous and really quite misleading. The notes should actually read, I promise to accept this note in payment of taxes, because that is the promise that nation states make to its currency users. The I.O.U. implied by the British government issuing pounds is that the British government will later accept those pounds as final settlement of tax obligations. Now, in another video, I'll look at why MMT goes on to insist that it's useful to think of spending as coming before taxation. We'll also look at why MMT argues that some level of government deficits are usually a good thing, how MMT understands inflation and its relation to unemployment, and why MMT argues that fiat currencies are better than the gold standard. And indeed, more generally, as the dynamics of money can form such strong incentive structures and power structures, so these dynamics can in turn be one of the underlying causes of the meta crisis we're facing. So, to fully understand all of the political economic challenges and ecological changes we're going through all around the world, then we need to develop a deeper understanding of how money really works, as it is such an important piece of the puzzle. And to be clear, MMT is just one perspective on how money should be understood, and it's not the mainstream perspective. But I find it compelling, which is why I read Wray's book to dig deeper into MMT. And although I found his book fascinating, it is basically a macroeconomic textbook. So I thought it'd be fun to try to find an engaging way to explain the ideas in a set of video summaries. So I hope you enjoy these videos and find them useful. But I'm also curious to know what you think of MMT. And are there any aspects of MMT that you'd like me to explore in later videos? Please do continue the discussion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, then please do subscribe for more videos like this about the various aspects of the meta crisis. Thank you for watching.